Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is another Sunday episode, and I'm really excited to share this one with you. I get to talk about literature, which is near and dear to my heart, and this is going to be similar to that video I did, 10 Gods Better Than Yahweh, although I wouldn't claim all of these are better than Proverbs, but that's kind of the play here. We just talked about Proverbs on my Secular Bible Study series, episode 20 last Thursday, and though Ecclesiastes and Job is also considered wisdom literature from the canon, Proverbs is the one where I started talking about it's really not that special. Yes, it has some wise tidbits in there, though it also has a lot of really problematic things, but it is a neat piece of literature if that's all we're looking at it as. The problem is it's supposedly the word of God, the creator of the universe, someone who knows everything. It really seems like it doesn't hold up to the claims. And so what I talked about in that episode was if Christians knew other ancient wisdom literature, they wouldn't see this as so special. They wouldn't claim that only this could come from a God. I have a whole stack of wisdom literature here that is ancient. We're going to be going through just 10 today. That's these 8 here, and also 2 books that I do not have physical copies of. These are just to show you that there's a ton out there that we're not going to get through. And by the way, I put some parameters on this. So one, we're not going to be looking at anything else that's kind of biblical, even if it didn't make the canon. So we're not going to talk about the Book of Enoch. We're not going to talk about the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. We are not going to talk about anything that is too modern, even if it's still really old. That would be like the Rubaiyat. This is 16th or 17th century. Same thing with A Book of Five Rings, Japanese, secular wisdom. We are not going to cover things that start to get redundant. So I have a couple Chinese, so I didn't want to cover Sun Tzu's The Art of War. I have some things from India, so I didn't want to also cover the Laws of Manu or the Tattva Sandabhara, or of course the Rig Veda. Also, we're covering some things around Tao and Confucianism, so we don't need to keep going through the essential Confucius, and it just goes on. We have lots, and I have a whole bookshelf full. So we're focusing in these 8 that are indeed ancient. So my cutoffs were 2600 BCE all the way up to just like 180 AD. There is a ton of amazing work that came within the last 1800 years, but I wanted it to be comparable to Proverbs, to show you that from many different cultures, from many different times, for law, for secular, for philosophy, and for other religions, man was able to come up with stuff that is equal or greater to the wisdom that we find in the Bible. So again, I'm not making the claim that all 10 that we're going to go through today are better than anything you find in the Bible. I'm just showing you other people were on the same pace. I hope that this will be interesting. Again, I'm really excited to share this with you, so let's dive in. So I've got my books up so that we can see them. I also generated an AI art picture for each of the books, just so we have something visually appealing to look at besides myself as we go through these. And the first one that we're going to be talking about is the Instruction of Shurappak. This is Sumerian or Mesopotamian. This can be traced back to 2500 to 2600 BCE, like 4600 years ago. Also a whopping 1600 years before Proverbs was written. There are many things in here that we can see directly in Proverbs. I'm not saying it's copied. I'm saying that a lot of people who were trying to think of wise advice to pass down thought of a lot of the same things. And what's cool about this is it is not religious in nature. This is a father writing to his son, a guide for life. So moral and practical lessons for leading a good and healthy life. Some of it is just so straightforward and simple. One of its lines is, do not do evil. It is not good, right? So we have kind of this broad scale, simple advice, but we also have specifics about how to trade, how to keep your name honorable, how not to put yourself in a bad situation like being alone with a married woman, why we should be listening to elders, what they have to offer, that if they live long, it's because they knew something about this life and they had advice to give that should be listened to. It has advice on how to be generous, how to give. It does have some aspects of talking about God. A quote that I'll read you is, a lamb is fattened for the sake of its master, but every person is for the good of the God. So it's not without some religion, and it obviously has a little bit of philosophy, but generally speaking, this is straight up practical advice, and it doesn't get more convoluted than that. Where Proverbs is riddled with issues about the fear of God and how we know nothing and can't know anything, and we're fools if we try, but we're also fools if we're foolish, etc. This is practicality. Remember your place, be kind, be generous, protect your reputation because it's important. Though it's not perfect, and by the way, this is my caveat for the entire thing today, none of the wisdom literature that I'm sharing with you, again, is claiming that it's absolutely better than Proverbs or that it is not problematic in its own right. Many of them, simply because of their time and date, are very sexist. Many do focus too much on the religious aspects, just like Proverbs. Many have what I would consider to be contradictory or bad advice, but it's all on par par again with Proverbs, and that's the point. This is what a lot of modern believers simply do not understand, is that the world was around, people were around, religions and philosophies and secular ethics were around long before the Bible. So I'm glad to share that one with you. Another very ancient one that we're going to cover for our second one, the Maxims of Patotep. Now, this is 2200 BCE. This is the ancient kingdom of Egypt, specifically the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom under the pharaoh Isisi. And Patotep is a vizier, a minister to the pharaoh. This again is a pretty darn secular work of moral and ethical frameworks. And many of them are even written in the form of Proverbs. Again, 11, 12, 1300 years before the biblical book. We see main themes of the importance of humility, respect for authority, proper behavior, early signs of virtue ethics, and it was clearly written to be used as a guide. Patotep was seen as someone who was wise, understanding an ethical framework that wasn't necessarily divine, just practical, useful, cause and effect. I want to read a particular proverb here that I think is really interesting, especially again in contrast with the biblical version. Do not be arrogant because of your knowledge. We see this everywhere. Again, we see it with Socrates. We saw it with Solomon. This is a good start, but it gets better. Take counsel with the ignorant as well as with the wise. This is in complete opposition to what the biblical book of Proverbs says, where we should not be listening to these people. We should not even be allowing for them to hear us, etc. Why waste words on a fool? But also, if you think you're important enough to follow that and to not waste the words on the fool, then you probably think yourself too wise, which makes you foolish. It's nice to get some simplicity and non-contradictory words here. For the limits of art cannot be attained. I love that. Let me give you some other examples. When you succeed a person of consequence in his office or one in the council, take your seat according to the law. Do not diminish the time of his giving judgment. It is a great thing. Just teaching people how to gracefully show respect even as they continue to move up and maybe outshine someone else. Now, I'm going to read you one last one. I want you to think not just about Proverbs, but about the rest of the Bible. Let's see what we see here. Do not make a man feel small when you speak to him. One is born noble, one is born low. There is no one without a father. God's work is wonderful. Love those who disdain you. Keep alive the man whose deeds are good. That sounds like a lot of stuff from the New Testament. There is no Jew, there is no Gentile. Love your enemies. Except here, I think there's some added benefit. Keep alive the man whose deeds are good, and God's work is wonderful. I can't tell you how many times I've heard Christians just say how wonderful and amazing and insightful Jesus' words were, that there's no one who's ever been like him.
Jesus was an ethical genius.
This is just ancient Egypt, supposedly the bad guys in the Bible, and they had this stuff figured out just the same. And yeah, some of it's problematic, but again, the Bible's not special. He hasn't said anything that anyone else hadn't already said. In fact, a lot of his versions are the worser case. I'll give you a great example of that when we get to the Analects in concerning the Golden Rule. So that's the Maxims of Patotep. Let's move on to number 3, which is going to be Aesop's Fables. This is 5th or 6th century BCE. This is Greek. So we're going to double dip in a few spots. We've done a Sumerian text and an Egyptian text. We're going to do 2 Greek ones, 2 Chinese ones, and 2 Indian ones, as well as some others still. But those are the 3 where just so much wisdom was found in the ancient world that we are going to showcase 2 different examples. And they're going to be pretty different from one another. So don't worry, we won't get bored. But let's talk about Aesop's Fables. They are typically attributed to Aesop, although some people believe this to be a legendary figure. Keep in mind, this is almost the exact same time frame as a lot of the early Old Testament was being compiled during the captivity of Babylon. It's a fun and creative idea where we have a collection of different animals that speak and act like humans, so we can see them act out in the world and then take a moral lesson at the end. You guys already know about this. This is where we get the tale of the tortoise and the hare. Slow and steady wins the race. It's timeless moral lessons, and also really cool, pretty darn secular. Almost as secular as it gets on this list, I believe. Keep telling me the books that are written at the same time, meaning they don't have access to Yahweh yet, or works that precede it, couldn't have gotten any of this moral, ethical value yet because we didn't have the objective moral code from Yahweh. Again, when you zoom out, when you read from other time periods and cultures, you see we're all just humans. And as we figured out what worked best, the best and brightest of us wrote those best things down in different ways, whether it's cute little stories with animals, or it's proverbs, or it's a story of a father giving advice to his son, or it's a wise advisor that's used to working for the royal king or pharaoh, disseminating that information downward. It's not special. This is just the history of mankind. Know God required. So really quick, just for fun, I'm going to tell you some of the most popular fables. We have, of course, the tortoise and the hare, which I already covered. We have the boy who cried wolf comes from this. The ant and the grasshopper, I know many of you are going to be familiar with. The lion and the mouse, and the goose that laid the golden eggs. Like, Aesop's fables has infiltrated our world so much, which is another point that Christians like to say, well, look, like, where would the Western world be without ancient Judeo-Christian values? I don't know. We'd probably still be pretty well off. We had some good stuff going for us. I'm not saying we haven't built and borrowed from the Judeo-Christian values, but to act like it's the only way to get wisdom is not very wise. Okay, but let's move on to number 4, which is the Code of Hammurabi. All I have is this dinky little version of it, so I'll just put it to the side here and we'll get into it. The Code of Hammurabi is Babylonian, and it is well before biblical times. We have a specific date even, 1754 BCE. Now, this one's a little different because it's simply a legal code. It's 282 laws, if I recall correctly. It's inscribed in a large stone pillar, so we have it before the 10 Commandments, in stone, that actually lasted, unlike 3 different versions of the 10 Commandments that we have no actual records of. Also, 282 laws seems to make a lot more sense than just 10, as you can get into some of the specifics and the finer points. Granted, the Mosaic Law is actually 630 laws in total, so it kind of errs on both sides, biblically speaking. Now, I am not saying the Code of Hammurabi is excellent. An eye for an eye is what it is best known for. Also, maybe an interesting thing to point out is that it was when they were in captivity in Babylon that the people of Israel were compiling their histories and putting together some of these things. It's quite possible that they knew about this code, or that the code had been continued to be passed down within Babylon, and they just copied some of the parts for themselves and gave credit and credence to their god for it. There's a lot to think about and look into there, so I'm not trying to make any claims in this particular video, but it is something to note. So again, this code is not perfect, but it is an attempt, a very early attempt, at getting a just system of order, having something on the book with an end goal of fairness. And I think that makes it pretty amazing. Let me just read you some of the different laws from it so you can get an understanding of more than just this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing. In fact, I'm going to make the case that even though the attempt here is at fairness, it still seems very barbaric considering what we are used to now. For instance, we have in our justice system, innocent until proven guilty. Well, this is an idea that very harshly stems from Law 1 of this code. If a man brings an accusation against another man charging him with murder but cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. We have Law 195, where if a son strikes his father, his hand shall be hewn off. Now, this is miles better than the ancient Israelites, which just for a son to disrespect his father means you stone him to death. So a non-violent crime gets capital punishment, where in the Code of Hammurabi, it is a physical crime gets a physical non-capital punishment. Still ridiculous, but it's in a better direction than the Bible, and it precedes it. But it does have some terrible things to say about how to treat women and how to treat your slaves, etc. So again, not trying to make the case it's better than the Bible or something we should be looking at today, but I thought it was worth including in the conversation. Let's go ahead and move right on to number 5 though, which is the Tao Te Ching. Now, the next few that I'm going to cover, the Analects and the Dhammapada, are all, sometimes they get mixed together by people who just probably mean well, but this is Tao, as in Taoism. Then we have Confucianism. Then we have Buddhism. Also, many people call these religions. There are certain religious aspects to certain subsets of these. I think a better way to think about them is philosophy mixed with some elements of spirituality, but I'm not really here to debate any of that. Taoism may have come first. This isn't too important. This is going to be 5th or 6th century BCE, and the Tao Te Ching translates most commonly to classic of the way and virtue. So again, wisdom literature here, wisdom, philosophy, looking for concepts of ethics and morality. The Tao is the way, how to live, how to be, what path to be on, living in harmony. Typically, the authorship gets associated with Lao Tzu, who is supposed to be a wise sage who compiled this. However, there is some debate around that, and that's fine. We don't really need to know it for today's purposes. But as you can tell, it is a very concise work, very enigmatic in style with short poetic verses. Let me go ahead and read you a few of these that I've selected. Simplicity, patience, and compassion. These are your greatest treasures. Can you imagine if that were true? Can you imagine if everyone who claimed to follow Jesus or Yahweh or Allah had that as their actual main goal? Simplicity, patience, and compassion. It's just a shame that this kind of philosophy didn't spread further and wider. It's hard to do without the threat of hell, though. To lead people, walk beside them. As for the best leaders, the people do not notice their existence. The Tao does nothing, but leaves nothing undone. When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. That's one of my favorite quotes from the Tao Te Ching. He who is contented is rich. This is such a stoic ideal as well. We're going to get into stoicism here at the very end, but I love that. Find a way to be content. Find a way to be happy with what you already have. If you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you are living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present. And yes, it's still spiritual, and I may not agree with every single thing, but there's not much baggage with these kind of precepts. This is probably right at the top, if not tied for first, out of the 10 that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So that's the Tao Te Ching. Let's move on to the Analects, which is going to be Confucius, which is also in China, probably just within the century that follows when the Tao Te Ching was. So if we're going to do our best guess of when it was all collected, put together, the Tao Te Ching would be the 6th century BCE. The Analects would be the 5th century BCE. The Tao Te Ching is Taoism and the Analects is Confucianism. The Analects here, also known as Lan Yu, is a collection of sayings and ideas and teachings by Confucius and his disciples. Confucius just being a Chinese educator and teacher, not claiming himself to be the son of God or some divinity. And it focuses on the responsibility of the individual within society and how to achieve harmony, and had massive influence on Chinese thought and ethics for a very long period of time. So once again, this is mainly secular or philosophical. It does contribute to the overall idea of Confucianism, but it's not the sole text for that. And though there are spiritual elements, the Analects themselves really just focus on, again, the individual behavior, the ethics and virtues, etc. In fact, I think it's so interesting. Buddha also has this attributed to him, but Confucius has the do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you, which is so much better as a rule than the golden rule associated with the teachings of Jesus, do unto others what you would have them do unto you. There's a lot of ways you can abuse that second one where you can't with the first. But again, Christians who don't know these things, they haven't read, they don't understand other cultures and teachings, they look at something like the golden rule, they hear that it's 2,000 years old, and they're like, Jesus was, oh my gosh, like so ahead of his time. Nope, behind his time and in a worse fashion. So let me give you some good quotes from the Analects here, and we will move on to the next one. Is it not a pleasure when you have studied and practiced for a long time to find that at the end you have made progress? Is it not a joy to learn and practice what is learned time and again? Is it not gentlemanly not to take offense when others fail to appreciate your abilities? Is it not gentlemanly not to take offense when others fail to appreciate your music? On and on. But man, just the appreciation for learning, and for learning for the sake of learning, and not to be offended or discouraged when others don't see the same value in it. Like, how advanced, how beautiful. In daily life, we should be true to the principles of society. In one's associations with others, we should be polite and with benevolence. When we serve superiors, we should be respectful. When we serve the people, we should be kind. If we are not efficient in serving others, this is not a virtue. I mean, as far as moral conduct goes, like, this is really, really good. How about on self-reflection? When we see men of a contrary character, we should turn inwards and examine ourselves. I love this. In comparison, this is being written around the same time as Leviticus and Numbers. Please go read these two texts side by side, and you tell me which one was on the right path. Let's move on to number 7. We're going to move from China to India for the next 2, and this is going to be the Dhammapada, which is part of the Pali canon of Buddhism. Now, Buddhism gets very confusing. A lot of people have different understandings of it. Some is very much religious and has its own baggage. Some is just spiritual. Some is just philosophical. Either way, though, reading this as a wisdom literature text, and this is compiled probably in the 3rd century BCE. So again, seeing what's going on at India in the same time that a lot of the books of the Old Testament are being compiled during the post-exile period at that time is really interesting. So the Dhammapada here is attributed to Buddha, whose real name is Siddhartha Gautama, which I'm sure I'm, by the way, just butchering tons of names so far. It's not my strong suit. But again, I mentioned it's part of the Pali canon, which is a collection of scripture in the Theravada Buddhism. So these verses are essentially a condensed guide to Buddhist ethics, wisdom, and the path to enlightenment. It covers a ton of subjects, maybe a little more broad than some of the other recent ones we just covered. Yes, it has your classic ethics and morals and principles for daily living, but also on the pursuit of the liberation from suffering and even into the nature of the mind. It's very philosophical, and it is very, very interesting. Again, the goal is enlightenment. The goal is nirvana, and this serves as inspiration for practical wisdom and teaching to that goal. So all the good stuff, the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and my favorite, the impermanence of all things. So let me read you a few wise quotes here from the Dhammapada. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. I love this. This is one of the first quotes you hear when you begin to really look into mindfulness meditation. And it's so simple, but so encapsulating of the entirety of this philosophy and concept. You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger. Contrast this with the teachings of Jesus that would come afterwards, where if you have anger in your heart, it's the same as committing murder. You are punished for the thought of it, instead of giving someone the practical and wise understanding that it is your anger that can lead you to action that is going to be disbeneficial for you and for others, and that can bring natural consequence and harm. All tremble at violence, all fear death. Putting oneself in the place of another, one should not kill nor cause another to kill. Can we just talk about empathy here? The goal of harmlessness. That's all this is, recognizing that other people feel and think like we do. And if they're subject to those things that we don't want to be subject to, we should not create those things to be afraid of. We should not condone or create the harm in the first place. An acceptance of the potential for happiness and the avoidance of suffering for everyone. It's just so beautiful. But let's move on. We're going to stay in India, but we're going to hop religions. We're going over to Hinduism, and let's do the Bhagavad Gita. Now, this is compiled between the 5th and 2nd century BCE. Not quite as specific in our dating here. There's a lot of texts that go into this. This is just a shorter part of the larger Indian epic, the Mahabharata. And this specifically is a conversation between Arjuna and Lord Krishna out on the battlefield. Lord Krishna is the charioteer, the spiritual guide. And what we have is a conversation between them that is supposed to enlighten us onto many moral and ethical understandings, specifically on duty, or the Dharma, and the law of cause and effect, or karma. So it highlights here the importance of righteous actions, doing what's right, even when it's hard, devotion, the pursuit of spiritual and intellectual knowledge and wisdom. So this one is definitely a religious text, but it is also framed within a more philosophical context here, especially this particular conversation, this particular part of what is one of the largest epics in written literature in the history of the world. And there are things that are problematic, just like we have in the Bible, and I'm sure they can be used just as poorly as the biblical version of these things can be, but there's still a lot of wonderful advice in here. And again, my claim is simply not trying to say that this is better or more moral, just that we had access to knowledge. In the same compilation period as the Old Testament, we have this text. And here's some of the examples we get. You have the right to perform your prescribed duties, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your actions. Again, this just emphasizes selfless action. We're not entitled to anything except to the duty we have, the dharma that we owe as being citizens of this world. It is better to live your destiny imperfectly than to live an imitation of somebody else's life with perfection. A person can rise through his efforts of his own mind. Without such effort, no one ever does, even if he is the son of a god. I also love some of the concepts about the Hindu deities. We don't try to make them triumphant gods. And without that claim, we get a lot less baggage when it comes to the nature of suffering and evil and other concepts like that. For those who have conquered the mind, it is their friend. For those who have failed to do so, the mind works like an enemy. This is so good. Again, we have these deities that exist in the Hindu concepts, but we don't give them the allowance that, say, the God of the Bible gives to Satan and to demons, where we can be corrupted, we can be deceived, we can be made sick because of unclean spirits. This is coming right out and saying, hey, your thoughts matter. The mind, the natural mind, can work against you if you haven't worked to master it. Just a true understanding of our thoughts and how they lead to behaviors, and behaviors to outcomes and consequence. These are the things that I mean, even within religious ideals, can still be so much more profitable than all of the inherited things we have to believe if we believe in the Christian God. Our last two books are both going to be around Stoicism, and we're going to move forward into the 1st and 2nd century CE, first with a Greek, Epictetus, and then with a Roman, Marcus Aurelius. So what I have here is actually the Golden Sayings of Epictetus, which would work just fine for us, but it's because the Enchiridion, which is behind me here on the bookshelf that's so nice, I did not want to get down and not have the nice visual aid. But we are technically talking about the Enchiridion, so I'm going to put this down. This is one of the primary text of Stoic philosophies. It comes before Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Epictetus is one of my favorite figures in all of history. I simply adore adore him. If you have not read something by him, go and pick out any book. It does not fail. But the ex-chrisitan is kind of the condensed version, just really looking at from all of his discourses, and it's designed for everyday use. It's meant to be in this readily accessible format for us. So again, anyone can pick this up. You will enjoy it and you will benefit from it immediately. 3 main goals: how to live a life of virtue, how to have self-discipline, and how to find inner tranquility or peace. What more do you want? And it delivers. So let's talk about the ex-chrisitan. Let me give you some quotes from it so you understand what I'm saying. I also want to point out that Epictetus was a former slave turned philosopher, and I think it gives these words an extra hit. Some things are in our control, while others are not. We control our opinions, choice, desire, aversion, and, in a word, everything of our own doing. So taking that self-responsibility, which I believe is very important, even though I don't quite agree with the amount of free will that Epictetus obviously does. You still have to kind of act as if. He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has. It is not things that disturb us, but our interpretation of their significance. The essence of good is a certain disposition of the soul, a disposition in harmony with itself, in love with itself. I think it's a really beautiful way of talking about the balance of virtue and it leading to that inner peace and acceptance. The thing itself is of no great concern, but your attitude about it, for in the end, it is not the thing that upsets you, but your judgment of it. So we'll end with that one. I just absolutely love it. All about our perception and how we view things and the power that that gives us to control, not the outcome, but our feelings and our emotions about it. Again, comparing this with Proverbs, runs away. And then we'll get to what may be my favorite nonfiction work of all time. And I know it's a bit cliche, but I don't care. There's a reason this is so popular, and that is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Here's the short version. We're talking 2nd century CE. Marcus Aurelius is the most powerful man in the world as the Roman emperor at the time. He is writing this book not for anyone. It's not even a book. It's a journal that he keeps for himself. This is a man that can have everything, that is encouraged to have everything, to give in to every fantasy and temptation. There is nothing that would be judged of him for taking anything in life he wants and having it. But he does not. He restrains himself. He keeps himself accountable with his journals. If a religion had been made around this journal, the world would be better off. I am 100% convinced of this. So just to stay consistent, I will read you a few of my favorite quotes, although it's not doing it justice, because to read my favorite quotes would be to read you the book in its entirety. It's pure gold. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Again, remember, he's not doing this to teach. He's not doing this for people to look at his wisdom and see it. He's writing this by candlelight in his tent while out on military campaigns, trying to ground himself and remind himself of what's important. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This is about taking for yourself the road of self-improvement, and it's giving you back your life instead of making excuses, even of the things that we cannot control. I love it. I love it. I love it. Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good. Man, compare that with the Christian ideal of storing up your treasures in heaven because today doesn't matter. Leaving your family behind is what Jesus says. Following him is the only thing that matters because the end is near and all that matters is eternity, the next life. No, this is what we have. This is what we're sure of. Don't give yourself years you are uncertain of. Be good now. Amazing. And lastly, the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. This is why it is so important. This is why I am sad for the Christian who thinks that the best thing they can do for themselves is to meditate on the good word of the Lord, reading things they either can't understand, have to make excuses for, or maybe are somewhat pretty like what we talked about in Proverbs, but laden with baggage. The happiness of our life depends on the quality of our thoughts, and the quality of biblical thought is not very high. That's the whole point of this whole thing. So to wrap up, my point here is we can do better than the Bible. We have done better than the Bible. Before the Bible was written, while the Bible was being written, and after the Bible was being written, in all parts of the world. Its wisdom should not be the claim of its truth. The Hindu gods would be just as real. Greek pantheon, the Roman pantheon, the Norse pantheon, they'd all be just as real. because they've all been equally wise or unwise. So take it for what it is. It was a writing of an ancient people at a time. It has some impressive things and some really ugly and horrendous things. Cool. It doesn't have anything to do with proving that God to be true, or it being the only thing we should adhere our life to on how we live. Most of what I covered here today is absolutely a better guide for daily living than even the New Testament, yet alone the Old Testament of the Bible. So that's all I have for today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. For Tuesday's video, I'm not sure, but I think that I'm going to be reacting to a video where people are talking about when the Lord protects some people, but not others. And then in Thursday's episode, we get to Ecclesiastes. So until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist hero, Jarrod, my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Kristi, and Sparky, as well as all my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in this mission or just enjoy watching the content, please consider joining these fine patrons and supporting the channel. Thanks and have a great day.